Welcome to the Plague Library. This is Joe, and I will be your reader for today. We're reading a news story, but I'm very excited to get into it, and I just wanted to take a moment and say, if you enjoy the content here, feel free to drop a like, subscribe, and check out our other videos. Anyways, let's get into this reading. Thanks. A Dreadful Ghost by Miss Craik. My wife, who was luckily sitting by me, was at first as much frightened as I was, but gradually she succeeded in quieting both me and herself, which indeed she had a wonderful faculty for doing. When she had drawn from me the cause of my terrified exclaims, we discussed the whole matter, in which we differed considerably. And on this subject, we invariably and affectionately do. She's a perfect matter-of-fact, unimaginative, and unsuperstitious individual, quite satisfied that the invisible, as in visible world, 2 and 2 must make 4, and cannot be anything possibly, such as making 5, only being, with all her gentleness, a little pig-headed. She does not see the one flaw in her otherwise very sensible argument, namely, the taking for granted that we finite creatures, who are so liable to error, even in material things, cannot see upon us what it is that 2 and 2 equals whatever is 4. There lies more faith and doubt, believe me, than in half your creeds. And it is just possible that when the devil tempted our forefathers to eat the tree of knowledge, he was laughing, as maybe he often laughs now, to think what a self-conceited fool a man must be, ever to suppose that he can know everything. When I preach this to my helpmate, who is the humblest and sweetest of women, she replies in perhaps the safest way a woman can reply to an argument, with a smile, as she did when, having talked over and viewed all of the sides, my dreadful ghost, she advised me to make it public, for the good of the community, in which we agreed, though differing. She considered it would prove how very silly it is to believe in ghosts at all. I considered, but my story will explain that. She and I were, I thought, invited to a strange house, with which, and with the family, we were only accompanied by hearsay. It was, in fact, one of those invitations on business, such as literary persons like myself continually get, and which give little pleasure, as we are perfectly aware from what motivates thy spring, and that if we could pack it up, our reputation and our head in a hat box, it would answer exactly the same purpose and be equally satisfactory to the inviting parties. However, the present case was an exception, since, though we had never seen our entertainers, we had only heard that they were not a show-loving, literary lion-hunting household, but really a family affectionately united among themselves and devoted to the memory of their lately lost head. He was a physician widely esteemed, and also a man of letters, whose death had created a great blank, both in his own circle and in the literary world at large. Now, after a year's interval, his widow and 3 daughters were beginning to reappear in society. And at the British Association meeting, held at the large town, which I not need to speculate, had opened the doors for their long hospitable house to my wife and me. Being strangers, we thought it best to appear, as I would advise all stranger guests to do, at the tail end of the day, when candlelight and firelight cast a kindly mystery over all things. And the few brief hours of awkwardness and unfamiliarity are followed by the nocturnal separation, when each party has had time to think over and talk over with the other. Meeting next morning with the kindly feeling of those who have passed a night under the same friendly roof. As my wife and I stepped from our cab, the dull day was already closing in twilight, and the fire only half illuminated the room in which we were shown. It was old-fashioned, rather gloomy apartment, half study, half sitting room, one end being fitted up as a library, while the other, pleasant, which was already warmed with hearts towards an unseen host, was spread out, that best of all meals for a weary traveler, a tea dinner. So hungry we were that this welcome, well-supplied, elegant board was the only thing we noticed about the whole room, except one other thing, which hung close above the tea table on the panel wall. It was a large, full-length portrait, very well painted, the sort of portrait of which one says at all, "What a good likeness that must be." It had individually character, the soul of a man, as well as his body, as he sat in his chair looking directly at you in a simple, natural attitude. You felt, what a beautiful soul this must have been. One that even 60 years of age, maybe? For the portrait, though, this seemed old. Would they have shed a brightness over any home and over any society where this person moved? "I suppose that must be the poor doctor," said my wife, as her eyes and mine both met on the canvas, which glimmered in the firelight with a most lifelike aspect, the gentle, benevolent eyes seeming to follow one about the room as the eyes of a most well-painted, full-face portraits do. "You never saw him, Charles." "No, but this is exactly the sort of man he must have been." And our conviction on the matter was so strong that when the widow came in, we abstained from asking any questions, lest we strangers might touch painfully on a secretly healed wound. She was a very sweet-looking little woman, pale, fragile, and rather silent than otherwise. She merely performed the duties of a tea table, whilst the conversation was carried on with spirit and intelligence by the 3 daughters, evidently highly accompanied women. They were no longer younger or particularly handsome, but they appeared to have inherited the inexpressible charm of manner which I had heard characterized their lost father. And they had, my wife whispered, a little greater attraction in her eyes, which was the exceeding difference they paid to their mother, who with not by any means so clever as themselves. Perhaps I, who had not married a woman for her cleverness, admired the mother most. The doctor's widow, with her large, soft, sorrow eyes, where the tears seemed to have dried up or been frozen in a glassy quietness, was to me the best evidence of what an excellent man he must have been. How deeply loved, how eternally mourned. She never spoke of her husband, nor the daughters of their father. The silence, which some families considered it almost a religious duty to preserve regarding their dead. We, of course, as complete strangers, had no business to break, and therefore it happened that we were still in the dark as to the original of this remarkable portrait, which minute by minute took a stronger hold on my imagination, my wife's too, or that quality of universal tender-heartedness, which in her does duty for imagination. I never looked at her, but she was watching either our hostess or the likeness, which she supposedly, the features of which the poor widow had been so deservedly a most strange picture, it seemed, in the wonderful, true simulation of life. To sit, almost like an unobserved, silent guest, above our cheerful and controversial table. Many times during the evening, I started, as if with the sense of a seventh person being in the room, in this social circle, hearing everything, observing everything, but saying nothing. Nor was I alone in this feeling, for I noticed that my wife, who happened to sit directly opposite to the portrait, fidgeted in her chair and finally moved her position to one where she could escape from those painted eyes. Now, I ask nobody to believe what I'm going to relate. I must distinctly state that I do not believe it myself, but I tell it because it involves an idea and more, which the reader can apply if they choose. All I can say is that so far as it purports to go, and when you come to the end, you'll find out why this might be a true story. At least, to me it was. My wife, you must understand, sat exactly before the portrait, till she changed places with me, and went a little way down the oblong table on the other side. Thus, one of us had a front, and another slightly foresighted view. Between us, it was the table. In the center, which stood a lamp. One of those reading lamps, which threw a bright circle of light below them, and leave the upper half, in shadow. I thought it was this shadow, or some faint flicker of the fire, which caused a peculiar feeling in the eyes of the portrait. They seemed actually alive, moving from right to left in their orbits, opening and closing, if they had lids, turning from one to the other in the family circle, as if conscious. And yet, the family took no notice, but went on in their talk with us, choosing common topics which unfamiliar persons try to plumb one another's mind and character, yet never once reverting to this peculiar phenomenon which my wife and I saw. I had observed the interchange with me more than uneasy glances during this paused conversation. The evening was wearing on. It was nearly 10 o'clock when, looking up at the picture, from which for us lasted half an hour, felt merely forever, I had steadily averted my gaze. I was startled by the marvelous fact to even consider it. Formerly, the eyes alone had appeared alive. Now, the whole face was rounded. It grew up out of the flat canvas as if, or like one of those terribly painful casts after death, except that this was nothing painful or revolting here. As I have said, the face was a beautiful, noble face, such one as under any circumstances you would have been attracted by, and it had the coloring form of life, no corpse-like rigid or marble whiteness. The gray hair seemed gradually to rise, lock, out of level surface, and the figure, clothed in ordinary yet modern evening dress, to become shapely yet natural, still preserving the tints of a picture somehow. Even the chair which it sat upon, which I know perceived to be the exact copy of one, stood empty on the other side of the fire, gave a curious reality to the whole thing. By and by, my wife and I both held our breaths, for from what seemed like an ordinary oil painting, the likeness had undoubtedly become a lifelike figure or statue, but sitting, the form of which was made by the frame of the picture. And yet, the family took no notice, but appeared as if, whether or not they were conscious of the remarkable thing that was happening, it did not disturb them in the least. Was nothing at all alarming or peculiar out of their daily life? No, not even when on returning with a book that I had gone to fetch from the shelves, as from the furthest end of the room, my poor little wife caught my hand in speechless awe, rather than fear, and pointed to the empty chair by the fireside. It was empty no longer. There, sitting in the self-same attitude as the portrait, identical with it in shape and dress, was a figure. It was a human figure, I dare say, and yet it looked like one. There was nothing ghastly, no corpse, though it was motionless, passionless, endowed, as it were, with divine calm. Yet there was an air, tenderly human, in the folding of the hands and knees, as a man does when he comes and sits down by his own fireside with his family around him. And in the eyes that followed, one after the other, each of his family, who now quietly put away their several occupants and roses, but none of them showed any terror, not the slightest. The presence of the hearth was evidently quite familiar to them. Awaken, no shudder, no repulsion, no outbursts of grief. The eldest daughter said, in a tone as natural as if she were merely apologizing, or indifferent to strangers, for some domestic ceremony, some peculiar form of family prayer, for instance. I am sure our guests will excuse us if we continue, just as if we were alone. Our usual evening duties still remain. Which of us is to speak to Papa tonight? It was then summoned back here, or why, or in what form? I knew not, and they gave no explanation. They evidently thought none was needed, and that the whole proceeding was as natural as a man coming home in the evening and being received by his wife and children normally. The widow and the youngest daughter placed themselves one on each side of the figure in the chair. They did not embrace it nor touch it, but regarded it with tender reverence, in which was mingled a certain sadness, but that was all. And then they began to talk to it, perfectly composed, and matter of fact, as people would talk to a beloved member of their family who had been absent for a day, maybe a little longer, but who would come home. The daughter told she had been shopping in town, where she had bought a bonnet of the color that Papa used to like, the books she had brought home from the library, and her opinion on them, the people she had met in the streets, and the letter that she had received during her day. In short, all the pleasant little chit-chat that the daughter would naturally pour out an affectionately interested living father, but which now sounded so unnatural, so small talk, such a mixture of the ludicrous and the horrible that one's common sense and one's sense of self, seldom unseen alike, recoiled. No one came. Apparently, none was expected. The figure maintained its place, never altering that gentle smile, remembering one of the spectral Samuel's rebuke to the witch of Endor. Why hasn't thou quieted me to bring me up? Or if all that superior calm with which, after death, we may view all things with such perplexed vision upon us, in one ourself, and in those about us. Then the widow took up a tale, with regret undertone of complaint running through it. She told him how dull she had been all day, how in the preparations for such strangers, meanwhile, me and my wife are shivering, sitting right there. She had found various old letters of his, which vividly revived their happiness, as she looked happy wedlock pictures. yesterday, one of his former patients died, and today, a professorship, which he meant to have tried for and given to be a gentleman, a favorite pupil. How his old friends were, Mr. A and Sir B, had been in a quarrel, and everyone said it would be never to have happened had the doctor still been alive, and so on. My wife and I uttered not a word. We sat apart still, spellbound, fascinated, neither attempting to interfere, nor question, nor rebuke. The whole proceeding was so entirely beyond the pale of rationale, cause and effect, that it seemed to throw us into a perfectly abnormal condition in which we were unstable to judge or investigate or escape from the circumstance which surrounded us. We knew nothing, absolutely nothing, except the very little that Revelation hints at, rather directly teaches of the world beyond the grave. But any one of us who had ever seen a fellow creature die has known the exact instant when the awful change takes place, which converts the body with the soul to a corpse without a soul. Convinced by an intuition which was stronger than all reasoning, that if for the life beyond to which the soul departs be anything or worth anything, it must be a little different life from this, with nobler aspirations, higher duties, purer affections. The common phrase breathed over so many a peaceful dead face, I wouldn't bring him back if I could. As a significant, instructive, as truer than all misty philosophy, mere speculation, tender than all the varies of fonder spiritualists, with big hearts and no heads worth mentioning. If ever I had doubted this, my doubts would have been removed by the sight of which I here depict, of this good Amise, deeply beloved husband and father, returning in visible form to his own fireside. No ghastly spectre, but an apparition, full of mildness and beauty, yet communicating a sense of revolting, utter unsanctity, and ridiculous, degrading contrast between mortal and immortal, spirit in the flesh and spirit of the flesh, stronger than I can attempt to describe. The dead man's family did not feel this, having become so familiar with their nightly necromancy that the ghastliness never struck them, and its ludicrous profanity never jarred upon their intelligence or affections, only made the fact more horrible. For a time, long or short, I cannot tell, my wife and I sat witnessing, like people bound in a nightmare dream, this mockery, or mockeries, the attempt at restoring the sweet, familiar relationships of the living and the dead. How many days or months it had lasted, or what result it was expected from it, we never inquired, nor did we attempt to join. It merely locked on and locked us in. "Will Papa ever speak?" entreated one of the daughters, but there was no reply. The figure sat passively in his chair, unable or unwilling to break the silence. And now, my wife, whose dear little face I saw, growing white and convulsed minute by minute, whispered to me, "Charles, I can bear this no longer. Make me excuse me of them. We will not hurt their feelings. Please, do not let them think we are frightened or disgusted, or of the like. But we must go, or I will go mad if we do not." And the half-insane look, which I had seen in more than just one of those pseudo-spiritualists of the present day, people who 20 years ago would have been sent to who knows where, but now are only set down a rather peculiar rose in those dear, soft, sensible eyes, which have been warmed and calmed my restless heart. I took advantage of the next pause in their communications, or whatever the family called them, to suggest that my wife and I were very, very weary and anxious to retire to rest. "Certainly," politely said the eldest daughter. "Papa, Mr. and Mrs. naming our names, have had a long railway journey and wish to bid us all a good night." The appearance bent on us, my wife and me. Its most gentle aspect, apparently, acquiesces in our retiring, and slowly rose, as if to not bid good night like any other courteous host. Now in his lifetime, no one had had a warmer, more devoted, admiring for this learning and lovable man than I. More than once I had traveled many miles for the merest chance of seeing him, and when he died, my regret at never having known him personally, never having been beheld by his face, was mingled with grief which I, in common with all his compatriots, felt at loss, suddenly, so suddenly, losing him, with his frame at its zenith, his laborers, apparently, only half done, but here, set face to face with this image, or phantasm, or whatever it was, of the man whom, living, I had so honored, I felt no delight, nay, the coldest, clearest of gaze seemed to shoot through me with a chill of horror. When going round the circle, I shook hands with the widow, daughter, one after another, and I paused before I got to the chair. I attempted to pass by. Resolutely, I looked another way, as if trying to make believe I saw nothing. But it was in vain, for the figure advancing noiselessly, with the air of irresistibly charming, dignified courtesy of the old school, for which everyone said the doctor had been so remarkable, it extended its hand, a hand which a year ago I would have traveled 400-500 miles to grasp. Now I shrank from it. I loathed it. In vain it came nearer. It touched mine with a soft, cold, unearthly touch. I could endure it no longer. I shrieked out, and my wife woke me from what was, thank heavenly, merely a dream. Or was it? Yes, it was indeed a dreadful ghost, said the excellent woman. When she had heard my whole story, we had again composed ourselves as a sole occupants on the railway, which was conveying us through the dead of night to visit that identical family whom I had just been dreaming about, who, as stated, we've never seen before. Let us be thankful, Charles, that it was mere fantasy of your overexcited imagination. that the old doctor sleeps peacefully in his grave, and that his affectionate family has never summoned him, soul or body, to sit of nights by their uncanny fireside, as you so horribly described. What a blessing that such things merely cannot be, nor should be. I replied, though that the dead cannot return, I will not undertake to provoke. Still, I think in the highest degree, it is improbable. Their work here is done. They are translated to a higher sphere of being. They may still see us one day, love us, watch over us, but they belong to us no more when they have passed. Mary, when I leave you, remember, I don't wish ever to be brought back again, to come on tables and knocking about chairs, delivering ridiculous messages, to delude inquiries, and altogether comport myself in a manner that proves, great fool as I may have been in the body, I must be still greater fool out of it. And Charles, said the little woman, creeping up to me with tears in her eyes, if I must lose you dearly as I love you, I would rather bury you under the daisies in my heart, bury you and never see you again until the day in the world when we're meant to meet, then I would have you revisit our old fireside as the fashion of this dreadful ghost.